Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone, and we're glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. Just an introductory note before we get started. If you've listened to one of our webinars before, you know we offer attendees a certificate of attendance. When the webinar ends, a post-event survey will pop up. It will list 3 questions about the quality of the webinar, followed by 3 questions titled Required for Certificate. If you would like a certificate of attendance emailed to you, you should answer those 3 questions. If you don't want a certificate, obviously don't answer them. So today's webinar takes an in-depth view of the ADHD brain as researchers make major strides in uncovering the neuroscience behind it and how that differs from the neurotypical brain. Brain imaging, structural MRI, functional MRI, and brain connectivity techniques is giving the world a better understanding of how the ADHD brain works and how treatment affects it. All the studies and all the data from those studies are enabling researchers to dismiss many of the myths about ADHD, among those diagnosed with the condition as well as those unaffected by it. We are very happy to have Dr. Jonathan Posner here today to tell us about the latest science behind the ADHD brain. He is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Columbia University and board certified in adult and child psychiatry. Dr. Posner has been treating adults and children with ADHD for more than a decade. He is director of Columbia University's MRI Research Laboratory, dedicated to the study of ADHD and related behaviors. You can ask questions of Dr. Posner anytime during the webinar. We will try to get to as many of them as we can after his presentation. To download the presentation slides of this webinar, click the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the bottom left of your screen. If you do not see the Event Resources tab, you need to refresh the page. So after all that housekeeping, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Posner. It's great to have you here today.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. So I just wanted to say a few other words about my background and then give you a little bit of an outline of the talk. So as Wayne mentioned, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I have been treating kids for close to 15 years. But in addition to working with children in clinical practice, I'm also a associate professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and direct an MRI laboratory where we study the brain mechanisms underlying ADHD and related behaviors. So things like impulsivity and attention. And the way that I decided to structure this talk is a little bit different from the initial description that was provided. I wanted to first start with some common myths or misconceptions about ADHD, because I think those drive a lot of what people think of the condition. And then towards the second half of the talk, I'm going to delve into some of the MRI research that my lab is conducting about ADHD. So with that, I'm going to start with the first very common misconception or myth about ADHD, which is that it's not a real diagnosis. And that's a perception that I'm sure many of you have seen. You can see evidence of that in lots of popular press and media. And so the question is, what's sort of driving that myth, and what do we know about that? And it's my view that the reason why that misconception really continues to persist is this idea that in psychiatry and in medicine that we call biological validity. And essentially what biological validity refers to is really understanding and defining the underlying biological causes of a disorder. And in most areas of medicine, we have that very well defined. Psychiatry, however, is somewhat of an exception in that regard. So let me give you an example. If you take the example of bacterial pneumonia, if someone goes to a physician with a certain cluster of symptoms, so fever, cough, shortness of breath, the physician is going to consider bacterial pneumonia as the potential diagnosis. Within that diagnosis, the underlying disease processes, what we call the pathology of the disorder, are well worked out. We know that it's caused by a bacteria invading the lungs, leading to an inflammatory response, and leading to symptoms. And not only that, but we also have objective diagnostic tests that can confirm that a person has pneumonia. So, for example, a chest X-ray or collecting cultures of the actual bacteria. With that information at hand, the physician then lumps together the symptoms that he or she is collecting plus the diagnostic tests, and then provides a treatment. And it's a treatment that specifically targets that underlying pathology. The case in psychiatry, and specifically in ADHD, is really quite different. We have the symptoms and we have the treatment, but we lack those two other important ingredients. We don't yet know the exact pathology, or in other words, we don't quite know the exact underlying biological mechanisms that lead to ADHD. And we also still don't have objective diagnostic tests. So we have subjective reports of symptoms, but we don't have an objective diagnostic measure. And one question that often gets asked to me as an MRI researcher is whether ADHD can be diagnosed with a brain scan. And for that, I can tell you, unfortunately, but unequivocally, no, it really cannot at this point. That is something that my lab and other labs are actively working on, and we hope that one day we'll get there. But the findings on MRI are far too subtle to provide a diagnostic instrument. In other words, there's too much overlap between what we see in an ADHD brain versus a non-ADHD brain to rely upon it as a diagnostic instrument. Now, I tried to make the point that in psychiatry at large, so this is true of all psychiatric disorders, not just ADHD, we lack biological validity. However, there are other important ways that we can be confident of our diagnoses, and I want to go through a couple of those with you. So the first is what we call reliability. And what we mean by that is that if two different clinicians evaluate the same child, are they likely to come up with the same diagnosis? So in other words, if I evaluate a child and a colleague evaluates that child, not knowing what my thoughts were, will that colleague and I both independently come to the diagnosis of ADHD? And it turns out that ADHD actually is a very reliable diagnosis. And these studies were done in what was called the DSM field trials. And it turns out that ADHD is actually one of the most reliable diagnoses that we have in all of psychiatry, and in particular in child psychiatry. The reliability of the diagnosis of ADHD is about on par with the reliability of diagnosing pneumonia on chest X-ray, which is considered quite good. The other important ingredient that we look at to determine if our diagnoses are real or meaningful is what we call predictive validity. And what we mean by that is that if a child is given the diagnosis of ADHD, can that actually predict meaningful outcomes? And in that case, we can unequivocally say, yes, it does. And the reason we know that is from what we call longitudinal studies. So a child is diagnosed with ADHD, and then we look at how that child or a group of children do over a number of years. And from those types of studies, we know that that the diagnosis of ADHD confers risk for a host of negative outcomes, including substance abuse, not completing high school, teen pregnancies, car accidents. There's a whole wide range of negative outcomes. So, another way to look at this is that when people say the diagnosis of ADHD is not real, I would counter that and say, well, it's a reliable diagnosis, one that clinicians can agree upon, and it's a diagnosis that once a child has that diagnosis, we know that child is at increased risk for a host of negative outcomes. And if that's not enough to say that the diagnosis is real, or if that's not enough to say that a child with ADHD should have treatment, that bar, I would say, is unreasonably high. Okay, so just to summarize the first point, ADHD can reliably be identified. It predicts a wide range of negative outcomes. And the other question that you might be having is, well, why is ADHD different from other disorders in medicine? Why don't we have that final bar of biological validity? And to that, I think the answer is actually fairly straightforward, and it has to do with the brain, and the brain being such an incredibly complicated organ. So in psychiatry, we are dealing with what is by far and away the most complex organ in all of medicine. The brain, for example, is composed of 100 billion neurons, and each of those neurons has on order of 1,000 synapses or connections. So we're talking about trillions of connections. So a remarkably complex organ that we're working very hard to better understand, but where we still have a lot of work to do. Okay. The second myth that I want to talk about is that ADHD is merely either a modern phenomenon or purely an American or Western phenomenon. And the argument there is that the diagnosis is really just responding to pressure from the pharmaceutical industry to increase prescription rates, or that it's a response to academic pressures and the drive to succeed academically. And I want to be clear that I would never want to dismiss those as important concerns and things that could be potentially contributing to an overdiagnosis of ADHD. But what I do want to push back against is the idea that ADHD is entirely explainable through those phenomenon, because that I think is inaccurate, and I'm going to tell you why. The first point, which the misconception that ADHD is purely a modern phenomenon, it's actually quite easy to refute that if you look through the medical literature. So if you go back, if you go back a century, you'll see descriptions in the medical literature of children that look very much like an ADHD child. If you go back a century, that specific diagnosis or that specific label didn't exist, but physicians were describing children that were hyperactive, impulsive, inattentive, all the things that we would put together to make an ADHD diagnosis today. Some of the earliest reports date back all the way to the 1700s. And there's two really nice examples of this that I wanted to share. One is from a German physician, Heinrich Hoffmann, who treated children in the 1800s, and then he wrote poems and along with illustrations that describe these children that he was seeing in his practice. One great example of that is his description of fidgety Phil, who he describes as, let me see if Philip can be a little gentleman. Let me see if he is able to sit still for once at the table, but fidgety Phil won't sit still. He wriggles, he giggles, and then I declare, swings backwards and forwards and tilts up his chair. So I think what's clear, what Dr. Hoffmann is describing is a hyperactive, impulsive child. He didn't have that label of ADHD, but clearly he was describing the same type of clinical presentation that today we would call ADHD. Dr. Hoffmann also wrote about another child, Johnny Look in the Air. It's about a boy whose head is always in the clouds and he's wandering about. And one day he's so lost in the clouds that he stumbles into a pool of water. So again, they in the 1800s didn't have the label of ADHD, but clearly what's being described here is a ADHD child who is highly inattentive. The second aspect to this misconception is that ADHD is purely a Western phenomenon or even an American phenomenon. And in that aspect of the misconception, we also have really good science to refute that. And this comes from what we call epidemiologic studies of the prevalence of ADHD. So essentially researchers going out into a community, assessing a wide number of children and determining the rates of ADHD. And when that has been done, and it's been done across most of the world, in the African continent, in South America, Asia, North America, Europe, we see that ADHD is indeed found worldwide. And by and large, the rates are fairly consistent. So this chart may be a little bit difficult to read, but on the last row, you have the worldwide rates, which come in at about between 5 and 6%. And you see, as you go across continents, there's some variability in those rates, but overall, they're reasonably consistent. Or to put it another way, they're consistent enough that it's hard to make the claim that ADHD is purely a Western phenomenon. If that were the case, we would see the rates very high in North America and Europe, and very low in all other continents. And clearly, that's not what the data are showing us. Okay, a third common misconception, and this is one that I think parents very understandably often ask about, and that is whether ADHD medications lead to substance abuse. And I think what's driving that misconception is a very, very common mistake in the way that we think, where we equate correlation with causation. And what I mean by that is that it is certainly true that children who have ADHD are more likely to abuse substances. And it's also true that children who have ADHD and take medication are more likely to abuse substances. But what's not true is that it's not the medication that's driving that effect. So in other words, it's the ADHD that's increasing risk for substance use. It's not medication. And again, we know that through longitudinal studies. So if we have a group of children with ADHD, who are taking medication, another group who are not taking medication, and we follow them over time, the ones who are taking medication are at no increased risk of substance abuse relative to the ones who have ADHD and are not taking medication. There's even some compelling data to suggest that treatment over time may even lower the risk of substance abuse. An interesting aspect to this is that we think that part of the biology of ADHD, part of the biology that gives rise to symptoms of ADHD, is the same underlying biology that gives rise to substance abuse. And those are brain regions that are related to the transmission of dopamine. The fourth myth that I wanted to briefly discuss, and again, this is one that commonly comes up and it's a common question, is that it can't be ADHD because he focuses so well, particularly when he's playing video games. And I'm sure for many parents in the audience, you've seen this, that if your child has ADHD, they may be very distracted or distractible in one setting, but highly, highly focused in other settings. And I think the idea here to understand is that ADHD does not mean no attention. Really what ADHD is about is a deficit in sustaining, or a better way to put it really is regulating attention. So environments or settings that are highly stimulating can actually lead to hyperfocus. And it's environments where the activities are more mundane, less stimulating, where you see the distractibility really come to the surface. Okay. So having covered some of those common misconceptions about ADHD, I now want to shift focus a bit and get into some of the MRI research that's being conducted, particularly in the lab that I work in. And the two major areas of focus that I'm going to talk about are on treatment development and prevention. So the first issue is, why do we need new treatments for ADHD? And I think the point that I want to underscore here is that our current medication treatments for ADHD work quite well, but unfortunately, many children stop the treatment or stop taking the medication. In fact, the majority of teenagers with ADHD will stop treatment within 2 years. And we know that ADHD is a chronic condition and really requires long-term treatment. So the leading reason given for stopping treatment is because of side effects. So I think this really underscores the point that we need better, more refined treatments, treatments that are less prone to side effects. As many of you perhaps know, the first line medication treatment for ADHD are psychostimulant medications. But what you may not be aware of is that psychostimulants were actually first developed and first used in children in the 1930s. The stimulant treatments that we use today have slightly altered the delivery mechanisms. So they allow us to use long-acting versions. They allow us to use liquid formulations. Those things are very helpful. But the underlying pharmacology really hasn't changed in almost a century. So I think the important question there is, what can we do to accelerate treatment development? We don't want to be waiting a century or 2 centuries before new improved treatments can come out, can be developed. So an approach that my lab is taking is using MRI, but in this case, not using MRI to understand what causes ADHD, and instead using MRI to understand how our treatments work. So as I mentioned before, Psychostimulant medications are the first-line medication treatment for ADHD. And we know their sort of immediate impact, increasing transmission of dopamine, but we don't really know how they alleviate ADHD symptoms. So in other words, we don't know what changes stimulant medications cause in the brain. We don't know which of those changes are actually responsible for symptom improvement versus side effects. So a study that's ongoing in my lab is really trying to tease that apart. What we're doing is we're enrolling children who have ADHD. We're doing a extensive clinical and neuropsychological evaluation. And then we obtain what's called multimodal MRI scans, where we look at the brain from a variety of MRI perspectives. The next step is that we then use what's called a randomized design, where we randomly assign half of the children to a placebo treatment and the other half to psychostimulant treatment. We treat them for several weeks in one of those two arms. And then at the end of that course, we then repeat the evaluation and the MRI scan. And what that approach allows us to do is to compare the pre-treatment MRI data with the post-treatment MRI data. And by having a placebo arm, we can disentangle effects that are just due to the non-specific passing of time versus effects that are specific to the medication. Now, ultimately, what we want to do in this line of research is identify brain changes that are responsible for symptom improvement versus brain changes that are responsible for side effects. And then with that information in hand, the next step would be to then develop new medications that specifically target those brain changes leading to symptom improvement. We also have conducted this line of research in parallel with a human or child study, but then also with a rodent study. And in the rodent study, we use the exact same design where we have a group of rodents. Half of them they're all given MRI scans. Half of them are treated with placebo, half with a stimulant medication. And then we scan them again sometime later. And the reason why we're doing that is because we want to understand medication-induced changes at the level of MRI, but even more so, we want to understand it at the cellular level. And the advantage of doing this in a rodent model is that at the end of the study, we then can dissect the rodent brain and understand at a individual cellular level what's actually causing the changes that we see on MRI scan. Okay, so that's one line of investigation that we've been working with. The other area that we're working on is prevention. And I think the first question to answer in that regard is why do we think prevention is so important? And the reason is highlighted in this graph here. If you compare the diagnostic rates of ADHD from the mid 1990s to 2015, the rates in the U.S. have nearly doubled. Now, it's certainly possible, even likely, that some of that increase is because of more awareness. So the actual rates of ADHD may not have gone up that much. It's just that we're more aware of the condition and are identifying children with ADHD more readily. But it still is a doubling of the rate, and I think it's unlikely that it's entirely attributable to improved awareness. There is a reasonable chance that the actual rate of ADHD is indeed going up. And I think that underscores the need for preventive approaches. So one of the things that the field as a whole, in my lab in particular, is really interested in better understanding are the impacts of prenatal exposures. So in other words, exposures during pregnancy that can influence the development of the fetal brain. And the reason why we are so interested in that is because there are several studies now, primarily in either epidemiologic studies or in animal models, that have linked a variety of prenatal exposures with increased risk for ADHD. And the exposures that I'm referring to include stress, trauma, various drugs, chemicals, and even diet or obesity may increase risk of the child developing ADHD. And the reason why this prenatal period may be so important is because of the extensive brain development that goes on during that period. So if you look at this figure in the bottom, you see the central nervous system during the first trimester and just how dramatically it changes and grows over the course of gestation. And various exposures can impact how that development unfolds. So my lab and other labs are really interested in conducting studies now where we obtain MRI scans shortly after birth in babies. And the reason why we think that is so important is because it allows us to get an image of the brain before all of the postnatal influences have really taken hold. So another way to think about that, if we really want to understand how prenatal influences affect brain development, we want to get an image of the brain before all the things that happen after birth really have their influence. So we bring babies in very early on, about 2 to 3 weeks after birth. And again, we use this multimodal MRI approach. What I mean by multimodal is several different MRI modalities. The most common one, and the one that people are usually think of when they say MRI, is what's called structural MRI. And you can see the baby here is looking at a picture of a structural MRI scan. And with structural MRI, that allows us to look at the size and the shapes of different brain regions. But we also have other approaches. One of them is called diffusion MRI, where we can actually map out the white matter tracks that connect different brain regions. And then we can also look at functional MRI, where we try to assess which brain regions are active over a period of time. In the studies that we're conducting now, as I alluded to before, we are enrolling women during pregnancy. We then do a detailed assessment of various exposures during pregnancy. Shortly after birth, we obtain MRI scans on the babies. And then all throughout childhood, we continue to do detailed assessments of the development of attention and hyperactive behaviors. And our goal is to continue to follow these children up to age 6 through 10 when the ADHD diagnosis really comes to light. And what that will allow us to do is to determine whether the prenatal exposures that we're seeing are influencing brain development and whether that continues on and predicts the subsequent development of ADHD. Now, the overall goal of this line of research would be to isolate those prenatal factors that increase risk and then hopefully to be able to reduce those exposures, not necessarily entirely eliminate them. Things like stress will never be eliminated entirely, but if we can reduce them, we can lower the risk of a child developing ADHD. So we have a series of studies where we're using this approach. There's a study that we're conducting in New York, in Puerto Rico, another study in Brazil, a study on prenatal drug exposure that we're conducting in Quebec, and then another study looking at prenatal diet and obesity, and that study we're conducting in New York. So to conclude, I hope I've convinced you that ADHD is indeed a real diagnosis, that it exists worldwide, and third, that although we have good treatments, we really need to do more to promote better treatments, more refined treatments, and to improve our prevention strategies. So with that, I want to open it up to any questions.
That was excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Really very good. There's a whole range of questions. So if perhaps you have to repeat yourself after mentioning it in your slides, I'm sorry, but people just have these pressing questions.
Sure.
What about the SPECT scan? Can it diagnose ADD?
No, it cannot. I know that people may read that it can in the popular press, but unfortunately, no brain imaging modality can currently diagnose ADHD. There's just too much overlap between what you see in an ADHD brain versus a non-ADHD brain. In other words, we just don't have the level of detail yet to really make a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. What is your opinion about TOVA as an objective measure to help diagnose ADHD?
So there are different neuropsychological assessments that can be used. TOVA is one of them that is commonly used. Another one is the continuous performance task. Mm-hmm. And those can be helpful in giving the diagnosing clinician additional information. But in and of themselves, they are not diagnostic, and they shouldn't be used to diagnose ADHD. And the reason for that is because there's really two reasons. One is because someone could do very poorly on the TOVA, but it's not because they have ADHD, it's because they have a different condition. So, for example, someone who is profoundly depressed is also going to have impairments in attention. So it lacks what we call the specificity to ADHD. The other issue is that it lacks what we call sensitivity. So there are going to be children who have ADHD, and in certain settings, their attention is very impaired. But for whatever reason, when they do the TOVA, their attention does not look so bad. It's similar to that example of the video game, where in certain contexts, a child who has even the worst case of ADHD can still actually pay attention quite well. Mm-hmm. Where neuropsychological assessments are more helpful is to really define and better understand a learning disability. Many children, on the order of about half of children with ADHD, also have a learning disability. And it can be very helpful in that regard, but less so for the diagnosis of ADHD.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about co-occurring conditions? Does brain imaging have any role to play in that, co-occurring conditions with ADHD?
That's a good question. So I think I would look at that from both a research perspective and a clinical perspective. On the clinical side, when a family goes to a doctor to be evaluated, unfortunately, the answer there is simple. It's unfortunately no, it really doesn't. We are just not at the point where we know enough about the ADHD brain to make it clinically useful. However, On the research side, it is quite important to think about co-occurring conditions. And the reason for that is because as our understanding of the brain improves, we are looking at the brain much more from the perspective of underlying circuits or brain systems. And those brain systems don't have a one-to-one relationship with a psychiatric diagnosis. So I'll give you an example that will hopefully make that clearer. Mm-hmm. So the brain system that we believe is involved in the pleasure response, or what we call reward processing, that's a brain system that has been repeatedly associated with ADHD, but it's also a brain system that's highly associated with substance use disorders. So as we learn more about the brain, it's becoming clearer that certain underlying brain systems may predispose to several conditions rather than one isolated condition. And that is very likely why we see so much co-occurrence of psychiatric conditions.
Mm-hmm. This is very specific, but can ADHD get worse because of a severe concussion?
That's also a good question. And certainly a concussion, a severe concussion or traumatic brain injury can absolutely impair attention. So certainly it can exacerbate ADHD. Most typically, though, the effects of a concussion tend to be time limited. But the severity of the concussion or the traumatic brain injury would likely dictate that.
Mm-hmm. What about a child who experienced trauma? Wondering, one parent is asking if that could further impair a child's ADHD. I mean, I don't know the interplay between the two, but that's what this parent is asking.
Yeah. So trauma, of course, comes in lots of different. There's lots of different types of trauma, and so I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer that question in the context of psychological trauma. So, for example, physical abuse. And the answer there is that absolutely yes. Trauma and childhood adversity increases risk for a whole host of psychiatric conditions, and certainly including ADHD. The trauma and adversity during childhood is one of the largest risk factors for any psychiatric condition, and that includes things like PTSD, but also includes ADHD, depression, bipolar disorder. It is an equal opportunity offender, unfortunately. The other thing that's important to consider is that the cycle may go both ways, in that having ADHD in and of itself may unfortunately also increase the risk of a child suffering some sort of trauma or adversity. So in other words, an ADHD child, due to any number of possible causes, potentially impulsivity or other causes, could wind up in a situation where they are unfortunately more likely to experience trauma. So it's a complicated and unfortunately very difficult problem.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an opinion on using neurofeedback in the treatment of ADHD?
Neurofeedback is an interesting and in some ways very compelling approach. And for those who aren't familiar with it, the idea basically is that using EEG to measure electrical brain waves, there are certain brain waves that are associated with better focus and better attention, and a child can be the idea is that a child can be trained to put their brain into a state where their focus and attention is improved. Unfortunately, the research on neurofeedback remains fairly equivocal. There are some studies suggesting that it is effective. However, the studies that have used the most rigorous types of designs and have had the best control conditions and the best blinding conditions suggest that it may not be effective, or it may not be any more effective than a placebo treatment.
A couple of women have asked that they've been diagnosed late in life, and they were wondering, as you refine treatments, do you envision any kind of gender-specific treatments?
That's also a great question, and there's two parts of that I want to answer. The first part was you mentioned that the question came from adults.
Yes.
And so for decades, really, we've thought of ADHD as a condition that always first manifests in childhood, and then for some individuals, it diminishes over development, and for others, it persists. Very recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been increasing data and very well done studies to suggest that may not be the case, that there may actually be individuals who clearly did not have ADHD as children, and that the ADHD only emerges in adulthood. That this is sort of a new area, and there's certainly questions about that still need to be sorted out. But another compelling aspect of that is that when we look at the underlying genetics associated with ADHD, this is still preliminary, but we are beginning to see that the genetic predisposition to ADHD that emerges in childhood may be distinct from the genetics that predispose to adult onset ADHD. And if that actually bears out and proves to be true, I think one can extrapolate from that and suspect that distinct treatments indeed are likely to emerge. We're still a far way from figuring out what exactly those treatments for adult onset ADHD would be. Currently, it's the same treatment that we use in child ADHD. But if the underlying genetics and therefore underlying biology are distinct, it stands to reason that a different line of treatment may indeed be effective. And I think a very similar line of thought could be used to predict that distinct treatments for different sexes also may be feasible. We're certainly not there yet, but understanding how sex differences determine the biology of different conditions in ADHD is certainly an area of great interest in the research world.
One mom asked, my son was born at 28 weeks. Does prematurity increase the chances of ADHD? Is there any correlation?
Yes, there is a correlation that prematurity does seem to increase the risk for ADHD. Why exactly it does that, unfortunately, we don't know. But children who are born prematurely are at increased risk. And similarly, birth-related traumas also seem to increase the risk for ADHD.
What would those be, birth-related traumas? Could you just...
If a child during birthing goes through a sustained period with inadequate oxygen, for example, that could increase risk for ADHD. We're unfortunately not at the point where we can say, okay, because the ADHD arose in that type of context, we can then prescribe a specific treatment for that ADHD presentation. That's certainly an area that the field would like to move to. But for now, we don't have that level of specificity in our treatment, so that the treatment still remains the same, regardless of the early risk factors.
Mm-hmm.
But it is that type of information is helpful to a clinician, for example, in figuring out whether the child really has a diagnosis of ADHD.
Mm-hmm. A couple of people wanted to ask, in your studies where you're brain imaging babies, does the mother have ADHD? Have you diagnosed it in her?
Another great question. Not necessarily. What we are trying to do, and this is a difficult issue because certainly an aspect of ADHD is genetic, and so the child is going to have half of the same genes that the mother has. Mm-hmm. So the mother could be passing on risk for ADHD if she indeed has it. So what we do in our studies is there's a couple different approaches that we use. One is that we assess the women for childhood ADHD, and then we can statistically control for that. In other words, testing whether the prenatal exposure increases risk for ADHD above and beyond some familial or genetic effect. That's one approach that we're using. And then another approach that we're using, which is more quantitative, is that we are genotyping the mothers. And there's a particular genetic profile called a polygenic risk score that tries to quantify the genetic risk for ADHD. And then we can ask the same question. So does the prenatal exposure increase risk for ADHD above and beyond that polygenic risk score?
Mm-hmm. This is an intriguing question. Is a baby born with ADHD, or does it develop over time? Good question. I would say both can be true. I suspect, and this is really in the realm of speculation because we don't have solid evidence to really say this definitively, but I suspect there are children who are born with either such a high sort of genetic risk that their brain is already sort of formed in such a way that they almost inevitably will develop ADHD. But I suspect the majority of cases are somewhere in between, where either genetic factors or prenatal exposures have increased the risk for ADHD, but where that outcome isn't yet determined. And the reason I say that is because brain development is remarkably plastic. There are lots and lots of changes going on from birth up until the first few decades of life. And what factors ultimately influence that development, increasing or decreasing risk for ADHD, are still things that we haven't well worked out. Mm-hmm. This is an interesting one as well. Do we know about brain changes due to long-term stimulant use by people with ADHD? Additionally, what about long-term effects of lack of treatment for people with ADHD? But maybe let's just take on the long-term stimulant use. Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple ways to look at that. So if you take a group of children who have ADHD and obtain MRI scans on them, and then they're treated with stimulant medication, and then they're scanned again, say 10 years later, just hypothetical. You could look at brain changes over that time, but where it gets very difficult is that if you did that, you wouldn't be able to determine which of those brain changes were attributable to the medication versus brain changes that were just attributable to development, right? Mm-hmm. Because children are growing for 10 years, and that process in and of itself is going to lead to substantial brain changes.
But the study that my lab and other labs have done suggest that there are significant changes in brain function that are attributable to stimulant medications. But those changes are short-lived. And we see that when we treat children with ADHD and a stimulant medication, and that you see the medications can be extremely effective in the short term, but once the medication's stopped, within a day, the symptoms reemerge. One of the things that brain imaging has shown is that the development of the brain in children with ADHD seems to be somewhat delayed. So in other words, the overall course of development in children with versus without ADHD is very similar. It's almost as if the ADHD brain is a couple years behind. But the very optimistic part of that is that it ultimately does catch up for most children with ADHD. So by the age, by adolescence, it's looking very much like a unaffected non-ADHD brain.
This is a thought. I think this might be the last question. I don't know, depending on how you answer it. You talked about, one mom asked, you talked about prevention. I thought ADHD was genetic. So I guess she's saying, how do you prevent if it's genetic? Okay, I'll let you go.
Yeah, let me answer that. Yeah. So that's a great question, and that comes up frequently. And what you're saying is true, but only half true, in the sense that we think the lion's share of ADHD cases are not caused just by genetics. It's what we call a gene by environment interaction. So in other words, the genes set the stage, but certain environmental inputs trigger that. And so what we're trying to look at and try to understand is that environmental component. Mm-hmm. It may be true that there are some cases of ADHD that are purely attributable to genes, but the lion's share of cases, it's a combination of genes and environment.
Mm-hmm. Where did the idea that this one might be simple and straightforward? Where did the idea that maternal stress/trauma and how that affects the development of ADHD come from? Where did that?
So two sources. One in human studies, essentially through observational research. Mm-hmm. So following large populations and noting that among women who reported that they experienced a high level of stress during pregnancy, their children had increased rates of ADHD. But then also through animal studies where the scientists can actually manipulate the levels of stress during gestation, and then following those offspring and seeing higher levels of hyperactivity and impulsivity.
That's very interesting. I think the hour is up. Everyone had lots of great questions. You had great answers. I found it really an intriguing webinar. I thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Yep. And thanks to all of the attendees for being here as well. Next week, Dr. Mark Burton will address the social challenges of ADHD and autism, similarities and differences, and the most effective treatments and interventions for both. So thanks for being here, everyone, and have a great day.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.